choose. So we'll read through all the essay questions in this exam, which is, I think, May, June 2019. And then whichever questions you want me to do, we can do those. Okay. Now, question 2, the first essay question says, explain what is meant by market failure and consider how far government intervention can reduce market failure, right? 25 marks. Then the second question says, the recent newspaper articles commented on the fact that the pharmaceutical company charged customers in the United States $800 per treatment, while it charged customers in Egypt $80 for the same treatment. Explain why company might follow this policy and what conditions are necessary to allow the policy to be successful. The B part for this question says, discuss whether oligopolistic industries always operate against the interest of consumers, right? Then the fourth question says, analyze how an individual demand curve for a product is derived and consider how this may be linked to its market demand. Then it says, use indifference curve analysis to distinguish between the effect of an increase in income on a consumer's demand for normal good and inferior good. Then question 5 says that cyclical and structural unemployments are the most common types of unemployment. Explain the cause of these types of unemployment and assess the effectiveness of government policies to reduce them. Sixth question says, the US Federal Reserve, the country's central bank, has pursued a policy of quantitative easing for several years. Explain how quantitative easing affects the levels of economic activity in a country. Then the B part for that says, discuss how far increase in wages and a loss of business confidence might affect the rate of interest. Then it says, 7A says, explain what is meant by actual economic growth and potential economic growth. And the B part for the question says, health, education, and savings are the most important factors in determining long-term development in developing countries. Comment on this statement, right? So these are all the essay questions that I've just shown you. Now, whichever any two questions that you want to choose, assuming that this is your actual exam, and those questions you would have chosen in your actual exam, just tell me the numbers and then we'll get started and discuss those questions. Okay, so you're saying question 7. Okay, perfect. Let's get started. Okay, now what is meant by actual economic growth and potential economic growth? Okay, have a look at this. So the first thing that you have to tell is that economic growth is known as, economic growth refers to increase in economic activity, right? Economic growth, right? So economic growth refers to increase in economic activity. Growth refers to increase in economic activity. Now, what is economic activity? We know economic activity is basically how much is the output a country is producing. Increase in economic activity. And how do we calculate economic activity? So that is calculated through GDP when we calculate the total value of goods and services that a country produced. Excellent, excellent, absolutely. Economic growth refers to increase in economic activity, or you can directly say increase in GDP, which basically means the same thing. And that is, then after mentioning this, you will say that GDP is the gross domestic product, which basically calculates the total value of goods and services produced in a country, right? So after this, you will say gross domestic product, one line definition would be enough, is the total value of all goods and services produced in a country. Total value of goods and services produced in a country, right? Okay. Now, this being said, you will come directly to the question then. Total value of goods and services produced in a country during certain time period. Produced in a country during certain time period. Usually it's a year, but it can also be for 6 months, or let's say a quarter, which is 3 months during a certain time period. Okay, now after you've explained what is economic growth, right? So we have said that economic growth is the increase in country's GDP, right? And what is GDP? We already know GDP is the total value. So if we calculate the total value of all goods and services that are produced in a country during certain time period, that would be that country's GDP. So if GDP is increasing, so simplest way to understand this is, let's say if Pakistan has experienced 5% growth, what does it mean? It means that compared to last year, this year, Pakistan's GDP has grown by 5%. So if let's say, if last year Pakistan had a GDP of $100 billion, so this year Pakistan would have a GDP of $105 billion because there has been a 5% increase. So that is what economic growth actually means. Right. Okay. Now let's look at the question. Arbab, you would better understand. It only says explain what is meant by actual economic growth and potential economic growth. So you can write that, but your marks will not be deducted, but you will also not get credit for that. Are you getting me? So you do not get credit for that because it is completely irrelevant and they haven't asked us for that thing over here, right? So I would suggest that you don't do that, right? Okay, now moving on. So what is the difference? Because the question is just focusing on what is the difference between actual economic growth and potential economic growth. So let's first talk about actual economic growth. Now, what is actual economic growth? Actual means that it is actually happening. Actual economic growth means that it is actually happening. By how much the country's GDP increase, that is actual economic growth. Right? Now, what is potential economic growth on the other hand? Potential is just showing how much more a country can produce. Are you getting me? So actual means how much in reality a country GDP has increased, right? So let me tell you with some figures over here, right? So if I say that this year's Pakistan growth has been, let's say 9% or 10% or 8% or whatever it is, right? Now, what I mean, if this is the actual economic growth that compared to last year, right? Compared to last year, Pakistan's GDP increased by 8%, right? That is what actual economic growth means. Are you getting it? And how do we show actual economic growth on a graph? How do we show? All of this would be part of your question. So you show actual economic growth through a point within the PPC to a point towards the curve of the PPC. Let me show you over here, right? So have a look at this. Now, let's say you have any good. We know on production possibility curve, you can take any two goods. So let's say you are looking at wheat and phones. So how much quantity of wheat and phones is produced in Pakistan, that would be represented to, that can be represented to Pakistan's production possibility curve, which is a downward sloping curve like this. Okay, now let's assume the country, no. Now that's the important point. That's the important point, Irbab. So what you are talking about is potential economic growth, because in that case, your potential outward shift in PPC shows that the potential to increase more has increased. In this case, have a look at this. Okay, so let's say at point A, a country was producing 10,000 tons of wheat, and let's say, I don't know, 8,000 tons of phones. 8,000 tons of phones. Now, when it moves from A to B, right? Now, let's say phone production would increase from 8 to 9,000 and wheat production would increase from 10 to 12,000. Now, this is actual increase. You have moved from a point within the production possibility curve to a point towards the production possibility curve. You have moved from a point within the PPC to a point towards the PPC. Now, this is actual economic growth, right? On the other hand, the potential economic growth is what you were talking about. Potential economic growth is shown how? How do we show potential economic growth? So that is shown that the PPC of the country is shifting outwards. Isha, so we have just started the class and we are doing this essay question that you can see over here, 7A. It says, explain what is meant by actual economic growth and potential economic growth, right? So far what we have discussed, let me give you a quick recap and then move forward from here. So the first thing that we have discussed over here is that economic growth refers to increase in economic activity, or simply speaking, an increase in country's GDP. That is economic growth, right? Right, no problem. So GDP is the total value. Then you can quickly give the definition of GDP. So GDP is the total value of all goods and services produced in a country during certain time period, right? After you've explained this thing, then you will differentiate between actual economic growth and potential economic growth. So first of all, writing a definition would help. You would say that actual economic growth is what actually is. Actual economic growth is the percentage change in country's GDP that has actually taken place during that time period. Calculates the increase in country's GDP that took place during certain time period, right? This is making sense. So right now we are defining actual economic growth. Actual economic growth calculates the increase in country's GDP that that took place during certain time period. During certain time period. Usually it's a year, but for different time periods, but it can also be for different time periods like 6 months or 1 quarter and so on and so forth. That took place during certain time period. Is this making sense, students? So that is the first thing that you will explain over here. Okay. Now, after you've explained this thing, you will move on and talk about what is the potential. Now, potential, on the other hand, just tells you how much more a country can produce. Potential economic growth calculates how much more a country can produce. It is not telling you how much more actually has been produced, but how much more a country can produce, right? So think about this. If I say that you can score A, what do I mean? I'm showing my confidence in your ability to score an A star or A grade, right? If I say that you scored an A star or A grade, that shows that what you actually scored. Is this making sense? Potential economic growth, on the other hand, shows a country's ability to produce a certain level of output. Students, are you getting me? Arbab, is this clear? To produce a certain level of output. Easy? Any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear? Right? Okay. Now think about this. How do we show it on a graph? I'll tell you how do we show actual and potential economic growth on a graph. Now, students, think about this. I was giving you this example that if Pakistan has actually grown by 8%, that means that between 2020 and 2021, Pakistan's GDP has increased by 8%. Pakistan's GDP has increased by 8%. How do we show that? So in the case of actual economic growth, you move from a point within the PPC, to a point towards the curve of the PPC, right? So let me show you how we show that, right? So we know production possibility curve is a graph that shows maximum output that a country can produce in terms of two goods. So let's say we have wheat on the y-axis and we have phones on the x-axis, and then you have a downward sloping curve like this, which is known as PPC. Okay, now think about this. Let's say a country was initially operating in point A, right? And then it moves from point A to point B. Now, what this shows actually is that you have produced more output. Am I right with this? So let's say you were initially producing 9,000 phones and 10,000 units of wheat. Then when you move from point A to point B, since B is higher than A, and you can see for yourself that at point B, you are producing more quantities of both the goods. So let's say now you produce 12,000 phones and 12,000 phones and let's say 15,000 units of wheat, right? So this is actual economic growth. This is actual economic growth. Any confusion so far? Right? Okay. On the other hand, how do we show potential economic growth? So potential is shown through an outward shift in the PPC. Potential economic growth, Arbab, is shown through an outward shift in your production possibility curve, right? And now, after we have completed this, I will tell you that what are the factors that cause actual economic growth and what are the factors that will cause potential economic growth. So just give me a second. Let me complete off the diagram first. Potential economic growth. Okay, have a look at this. So let's say again, you have wheat on the y-axis and you have phones on the x-axis. Okay, now if let's say initially your PPC was at this level, now with more resources, when is your potential? When does the country's potential to produce more increases? So a country's potential to produce more increases when it discovers more resources. Students, are you following me? So when a country discovers more resources, when the country invests in new technology, when the labor force of a country becomes more productive, more educated, more trained, they can become more productive and they can produce more efficient and they can produce more output. That is when the potential economic growth will take place. Are you getting me or not? Whereas for the actual economic growth happens when there is either a rightward shift in the aggregate demand or a rightward shift in the aggregate supply, right? So students, are you getting me? Potential is just showing that how much a country can actually produce, the potential. the ability, yes or no? Whereas actual economic growth is showing you what is happening at the moment, how much a country is producing. So for the actual economic growth, let's say if initially the country was at this level, this was aggregate demand, this was aggregate supply, your original GDP was at Y1. Now, if any of the two curves, shift to the right, so let's say if aggregate supply of a country, of this country shifts from AS1 to AS2, then what will happen? Your new macroeconomic equilibrium would be where the new aggregate supply intersects with aggregate demand, and you can see for yourself that your real GDP would be higher. Your real GDP would be higher than before. So that means that the actual economic growth has increased. Decreases. Right, exactly, Arbab. That's correct. Right. And similarly, if your aggregate demand is increasing, why would aggregate demand increase? I will tell you the reason for that. Again, if your aggregate demand is also shifting to the right, that would cause an increase in the GDP. Yes or no? Students, are you following me or not? So actual economic growth can happen either due to increase in aggregate demand or due to increase in aggregate supply. Easy? Any confusion? Anything that's not clear? Anything you want to ask me, right? Okay, now what is aggregate demand made up of, students? What is aggregate demand made up of? Aggregate demand is made up of 5 components that we already know: consumption, investment, G, exports, minus imports. Any confusion so far, right? Exactly. So if any of these components is increasing, consumption or investment or government spending or exports, right? So your aggregate demand will shift to the right. So for this question, along with the graphs that we have discussed, you will explain all of this concept. Any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear? Okay, now let's look at the B part. So health, education, and savings are the most important factors in determining the long-term development in developing countries. Comment on this statement, right? In determining the long-term development in developing countries, right? Okay, now for the B part, let's read the B part and then we'll do it together. The question says health, education, and savings are the most important factors in determining the long-term development in developing countries. Okay, now it's talking about 3 things. It's talking about 3 things: health, education, and savings, right? Health, education, and savings. Okay, now have a look at this. So first of all, you will spend some time to explain what is development, right? Now, if you remember, we discussed in a class that development refers to rise in living standards. So how high or how low are the living standards of citizens in a country? That is what determines the development of a country. Living standards, right? You can also call this as quality of life, and so on, right? So living standards of a country are based on exactly quality of life. So that is based on a couple of different things, like how much is the access to education, how much is the access to healthcare, quality of the food that people eat, clean drinking water, whether they have access to clean drinking water, whether they have access to electricity. I mean, there are so many different things. And if you remember, we also talked about different indicators of development. Now, you don't need to talk about the indicators of development in detail, but you will give some basic idea that development of a country refers to the rise in living standards, right? To be more precise, development is actually rise in living standards. Yes or no? It's rise in living standards. Okay. And how does development take place? So when you spend more on education, healthcare, and all that stuff. Now, the question is saying that these are the 3 most important things. These are the 3 most important things in increasing the development of a developing country: education, healthcare, and savings. Okay. Now, first thing that you have to talk about is that how each of these, first thing that you have to talk about in this question, Arbab, is to talk about how each of these things will contribute to development, how each of these things will contribute to development in a country. Okay. Now, let me give you some hints, right? So what would, right, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that. Yes. So let's first talk about the easier ones. So let's talk about the education first. So you can start off by saying that education is basically the formal education, which shows how many years a typical student goes to school and so on, right? And if you remember in discussing what is that called? Multidimensional poverty index, we talked about mean years of schooling or average years of schooling. Now, what is this showing us? This is showing that how many years a typical student goes to school, right? That is an easy or convenient indicator that many countries use to measure their performance on education. Now, how is education important for development? That is what you need to tell. How is education development important for development? That is what you need to tell in this question. So you will say, with more educated labor force, what happens? With more educated labor force, right? Develop skills of people which benefit the country, right? Exactly. The workforce will be more productive and creative, will be more productive and creative, which means it can produce more output, which means more output can be produced, more output of better quality can be produced. Okay, in what other ways would education be helpful? Of what else can be produced? How else is education beneficial for the development of a country? Right? Apart from this, think about this, apart from economic benefit, right? We know education also gives other benefits. Arbab, education also gives other benefits, like, think about this. If people are more educated, crime rates will be low. Are you getting me? Now you will be explaining all of this in paragraphs, but I'm just giving you the bullet points, right? Because if two people are more educated, that means that they don't want to, they know what the law is, and they will not engage in any, illegal activity or criminal activity, or at least their chances of engaging in any criminal activity is low, right? Then another benefit of education is more civilized society. Now, what is more civilized means that they have more civic sense, right? They will not, they will be more decent and mature people. They will not do things that can cause harm to the other people or inconvenience to the other people, and so on and so forth, right? So more civilized society and so on and so forth, right? So this is how education will create more development in the country. Then moving on towards the healthcare. Now, again, healthcare also has two benefits. So one benefit of healthcare is economic benefit, right? Now, what do I mean when I say economic benefit? So economic benefit means that when people will be more healthy, just imagine if people in a country have access to healthcare, which means that they're more healthy, right? There are less diseases like the COVID and all the other problems that we face. Exactly, child mortality would also be is basically the challenge related to poor healthcare, right? So if people are more educated, if people are more healthy because there are better quality healthcare services available in the country, then this means that they will be more productive, right? Healthy labor force is more productive labor force. Yes or no? So healthy people is more productive. We know that these people, right? These people will be more healthy, and therefore they will be working harder and they will produce more output and things like that, right? Another non-economic benefits of healthcare would be that people will have longer life expectancy during that time period. These people can enjoy a happy life, right? And therefore, again, it will increase the living standards of a country, right? So that is another thing that healthcare provides, right? So do you understand the difference between economic benefit and non-economic benefit, Arbab? Right? So economic benefit, just like we discussed it for education, economic benefit of education is that educated labor force will be more productive, which means that they're more efficient, they're more high quality workers, they are more trained and they're more creative, right? Which means that more output can be produced in the countries. Now, this is economic benefit of education, that education would lead to eventually economic growth and economic prosperity. But it is not just all. Apart from these economic benefits of education, there were some non-economic benefits of education, right? Now, what are some non-economic benefits of education? That people are more educated and civilized, which means that lower will be the crime rates. They will not engage in anything that is harmful for the other citizens and so on and so forth, right? So all these things, right? Similarly, for the healthcare as well, you will have economic benefits, which means that healthy labor force is more productive. They will not take days off because they're healthy. They go to work, they produce more output, and that eventually benefits the entire country. And non-economic benefits would be things like people are more healthy, so they are more mature. They are spending a prosperous life. They're happy about their lives. There will not be social problems like high divorce rates or perhaps high suicide rates or high depression cases. Are you getting me or not? So all of these things directly channel into healthcare facilities and lower, obviously, child mortality rates and so on and so forth, right? Are you getting me? So this is how education and healthcare create or contribute to development in a country. Now comes in the third and the last type that the question asked for, savings, right? Now you said savings will, what did you say about that? Savings will reduce investment, right? That was your comment. Let me read your comment again. That reduce the GDP of the country. Yes. Now that's a good observation, right? Now it depends how people are saving. Now, Prabha, you have to listen to this very carefully, right? Non-banking. Right. Now, either the countries can save on their own, right, which we are defining as non-bank saving, and then banking saving or bank saving, right? Now, about if, let's say I have, what is saving? So think about it. Saving is basically excess of my expenditure. So my income above my expenditure is my saving. So let's say if anyone earns X amount of dollars per month, right? So that would be their income. And then from their income, they pay their expenses, they buy, let's say, food, they spend on utility bills, they spend on car and blah, 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 blah. Whatever amount they're left with at the end of the day, that is their savings. Now, either they can put their savings in a bank account or they can put their savings, just leave their savings lying in cash form at their home. Now, if the savings are lying at the home and, then obviously the person who is saving that amount is not benefiting from it, right? Because he's not putting that money someplace, right? So that person is obviously not benefiting out of that. And also, this money is not benefiting any other person in the economy. Abba, do let me know if you got this. Think about this. If I put my money in a locker, I have a locker at home, I have a cupboard at home, and I just put my money over there. All of my savings are in the cash form lying over there. Now, this money is neither benefiting me. How could it benefit me? It could have benefited me if I would have put this money in a bank account, or I would have deposited this money in stocks, invested this money in stocks. I would have earned some interest and so on and so forth. And neither this money is generating exactly interest, basically. And neither this money is being used by anyone else, because we know when we put our money in a bank, what happens? We did talk about the credit multiplier process, right? We did talk about how banks create how banks issue loans and so on and so forth, right? So when a saver or a depositor puts his or her money in a bank account, that money is channelized to borrowers, right? And borrowers make use of that money in the form of what? In the form of, they have the amount. They can buy something for their own, right? They can buy something for themselves, like a new car or a new house, or they can invest this money in a business or something of the sort, right? So coming back to the point, if the savings are through non-banking channels, right? So if you are just saving by putting or depositing your money in a bank account, at your home, and not doing anything with that money, so that will definitely reduce the GDP of the country, because that is a leakage. Yes or no? Are you getting me? Reduce GDP of a country, right? Because that's a leakage. Neither you're using that money yourself, nor you are letting anyone else use that. But if you put your money in a bank for the sake of savings. It will generate, or you can be more explicit about it. Banks can create loans through which borrowers can to buy goods and services or invest in a business. Is this making sense? Or invest in a business, right? Now think about this. If your savings are through a banking channel, right, then it is definitely beneficial for the country. Why? Because think about this. When people take money and they invest in a business, or they, put that money in a new business or something of the sort. Now that is beneficial. How so? Because that will generate more jobs, that will create more jobs, that will produce more output, more GDP for the country, and so on. Right? Now, does this make sense? So let's look at the question one more time, and then we'll try to wrap this up. So the question was saying health, education, and savings are the most important factors in determining long-term development in developing countries. Comment on this statement. So we started off with this question by defining what is development. So we said development is the quality of life or the standard of living in a country, right? Then we said that development of a country is dependent on a lot of factors, right? So that's obviously dependent on education, healthcare, and other things, but there are some other things as well, right? Like for instance, how much is the pollution level in a country, or how much is the, let's say, job opportunities, and things like that. So they are also part of development of a country. Then, since the question was asking you about these three factors, we'll talk about the significance of each of these factors one by one. So firstly, for the education, you said with more educated labor force, the workforce will be more productive, they will produce more output of better quality, and that would benefit everyone in the country. So that's first thing. Apart from that, education is also beneficial for the country because the crime rate would be low, people will be more civilized, and so on, right? Similarly, for the healthcare, you said that with healthy workforce is more productive, which means that they can produce more output. Sorry about that. They can produce more output, and so on, right? And then on the non-economic side of healthcare, you can say people can live longer lives, they will be more happy, can live longer and prosperous lives. Is it simple? Any confusion so far? Right? Okay. Now, in the end, we talked about the savings. And then again, in the savings, we divided that in two categories. If someone is saving in a non-banking channel, right? So that is not very effective, and that is not really helping with the development, because that money is neither used for that person nor for someone else. But if you're putting your money in a bank account, then that is creating loans for the new people. Now, who are these new people? So these are the borrowers. So why would they want to borrow money from a bank? Because they want to start their own business, or let's say they want to buy some goods and services. Now, in that case, there is increase in GDP. In this case, more economic, more consumption, or more investment. Are you getting me? We have just seen that aggregate demand is made up of C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So when you are putting your money in a bank account and banks are issuing loans through your money, then that will create more consumption. Investment would result in more economic activity and more investment, more GDP eventually. More consumption, investment results in higher economic activity. Higher activity. Right? Is it simple? Any confusion? Anything that's not clear? Right? We good on this? Okay. And then towards the very end, you will say, Arbab, that these are not the all factors that affect development. Then there are some other factors as well. Do you remember in the multidimensional poverty index and in measurable economic welfare? So think about this, multi-dimensional poverty index. So basically we discussed three indicators of development: multidimensional poverty index, then we discussed measurable economic welfare, and human development index. Measurable economic welfare and human development index. So in these three indicators of development, we talked about couple of indicators of development, right? Couple of factors that affect development. Like, let me give you some examples. We talked about that income is important, human development index, right? We talked about GDP per capita is an important indicator for development. Why? Because if people have higher incomes, then technically they can afford better education, they can afford better healthcare, they can buy all the important necessities. Right? No. You don't need to go in detail. Arbab, no. But what factors, the factors of the factors or the statistics that you use to calculate development in these indicators, that is what you need to talk about. So if I have to give you a specific example, think about this. In multidimensional poverty index, we said that things like access to clean drinking water. Now this might sound very basic and very obvious, right? But there are a lot of countries, including Pakistan, some areas of Pakistan, where people don't have access to clean drinking water. And similarly, access to clean drinking water and, the type of cooking fuel that they are using, right? So you would say that education, healthcare, and savings are important for the development of a country, but perhaps not the most important things. Why? Not the most important thing, because there are other indicators and other factors that more directly contribute to the development of a country, which includes, as I was telling you, right, income levels are very important. So if there are increasing income levels, then automatically it means, or obviously it means, that people will have more purchasing power with which they can buy better quality goods and services, right? Then moving forward from here, other factors that can affect your development could be, the pollution levels, right? So all the big cities of the world, like Shanghai, I was telling you, Delhi, Lahore, all these countries have very high pollution levels. Now, how is that affecting the development of a country? Because obviously that creates some health problems, especially respiratory problems, right, related to lungs and respiration and so on, which can affect the health condition of individuals and so on and so forth, right? So these are all different factors that affect the development. So in the end, you have to give your conclusion that whether you think education, healthcare, and savings are the most important factors that affect development, as the question was saying, or there could be some other factors as well that are most important, right? Is this simple? Okay, now let's quickly discuss one more question out of these, Arbab, that you would have done in the exam. Apart from 7, which are the question you would have attempted? Yeah. Which other question you would have attempted? 5. Okay, let's do that. Cyclic and structural unemployment are the most common types of unemployment. Explain the causes of these types of unemployment and assess the effectiveness of government policies to reduce them. Okay, now first of all, the question is saying that cyclic and structural unemployment are the most common types of unemployment, right? So first of all, you will explain what is cyclical and what is structural unemployment, and then you will talk about how the government can control these. So we did talk about both of these in our classes. We said cyclical unemployment happens when there is decrease in economic activity. So when there's depression or recession, as we say in a country, that means that, economic activity is low for some reason, like it happened during COVID. A lot of people got unemployed. Why so? I'll tell you, right? And what is structural unemployment? Structural unemployment is when there is some sort of structural change in the economy, right? Or this could also be defined as technological unemployment. How this happens basically is, let's say new technology is coming up. You must be, we keep reading about this new technology here and there, right? Like easiest or simplest example of that could be perhaps computers, right? Now, computers have become so fast and they can do so many calculations and so many things so quickly that you don't need manual people. Previously, people used to be accountants. Now, what's the purpose of an accountant? Accountant is basically responsible for managing all the data, preparing statements, and so on and so forth. Now with computers, you don't need so many people out there to keep a track of the transactions and all that stuff, right? One computer is good enough to do that, right? So that is technological unemployment, right? Similarly, think about all the production that takes place in the world, right? Previously, production used to take place manually. People used to manually handmade things like, I don't know, furniture, cars, laptops, and so on. Now everything is done through machines, right? Again, the demand for labor has decreased, so that is structural or technological unemployment, right? Then there could be some other changes, structural changes in the economy, right? So simplest example of that could be that back in the day, there used to be a lot of concept of going to a shop to buy something, yes or no? Before laptops and before internet was so readily available, people used to go to shops to buy goods. Now you have websites for that. You just order and a person comes outside your home, delivers the things and goes back, right? So all these things that are taking place in an economy are known as structural or technological unemployment, right? So first of all, you will define both of these two types of unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is when there's decrease in economic activity because of different reasons. Sometimes it is just the business cycle, decrease in economic activity, or sometimes it's a recession, some sort of what could be a reason, some internal conflict going on in the country, or let's say a pandemic hit the world, so there was a big global recession that took place. People were all locked into their homes, they were not going out, and so on and so forth, right? So these could be reasons for a recession. And then, as we discussed, what is structural unemployment? Structural unemployment is when there's structural change in the economy that happens because of things like technological advancement taking place, technological changes taking place, and all that stuff, right? So after you have defined this and given a couple of examples, now think about this. This is for 25 marks question. This is a 25 marks question, Arbab. So you have to give a couple of different examples and all that stuff, right? Then after you have discussed all of this in detail, then you'll talk about how the government can correct or solve these types of unemployment. Then for that, you would be expected to talk about possible strategies that countries use or governments use to solve these. Now, if I talk about cyclical unemployment first, do you remember we talked about expansionary fiscal and monetary policy? Now, whenever there is a recession, what happens? Countries want to fight that through giving incentives to the people to spend. Expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. What type of incentives? I'll tell you. Expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. Okay, now have a look at this. Think about this. Or I can quickly draw the graph over here, right? So if you have a look at this. If you have the macroeconomic equilibrium graph that we have talked about and looked at again and again, right? So just a second. Okay, so on the y-axis, you have general price level. On the x-axis, you have real GDP, right? And then downward sloping is your aggregate demand, upward sloping is your aggregate supply, right? Okay, now initially, the GDP of a country was at this level, right? Easy, simple, any confusion. Now, what happens if a country wants to increase its economic activity? If the government of a country wants to increase the economic activity, what would it do? It would boost economic activity through fiscal and monetary policy. How would you do that? Think about it. If you remember, I gave you examples that fiscal policy is about taxes and government spending. So whenever you want economic activity to increase, what would you do? You will reduce taxes. Why? Because taxes is the money that the government takes away from the people. So if you reduce taxes, this means that more money would be available with the people to spend, right? So you lower interest rates, that is monetary policy, very good. So you reduce taxes and increase government spending, that is expansionary fiscal policy, that would cause aggregate demand to shift to the right. Or another thing that you do through monetary policy, which is about interest rates, and that is to reduce interest rates. So that is the easiest way that the government fights cyclical unemployment, right? Now let's talk about some real life examples as well. You can totally give, if you see such a question on the exam, you can totally give some recent examples like that of COVID and so on and so forth, right? Now what happens in the case of COVID, what the government did, a lot of people were laid off, firms were not making profit, restaurants closed down, movie theaters closed down, people were not going out, cinema, and all the shopping malls were closed down and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of people started becoming unemployed. To help those people, a lot of different countries' government gave relief packages. If I'm not wrong, even in Pakistan, the government started some scheme or some program related to that. I don't know what was the scale or how many people it benefited, but relief packages, right? In USA, giving you a simple example, government gave a stimulus check during COVID because people were out of work. So that was $1,500 per person or per household or something of the sort, right? So, right, transfer payments, especially helping the very poor people. So in countries like developing countries like Pakistan, because government can't support like technically everyone, so it only focuses on the very poor people, right? Like giving them food, free food schemes, and giving them, income support so that they can at least buy the basic necessities and so on. Whereas for developed countries, obviously they have more funds and they have more resources, they can afford to give transfer payments to majority of the people or most of the people and so on, right? So that is one way of fighting cyclical unemployment. Is this making sense? Okay. Then moving on to structural unemployment. Now, structural unemployment requires more long-term effort, more long-term effort. How so? Because think about this, it's happening because of the fact that people skills are becoming outdated. Yes or no? Long-term, more long-term effort needed. Okay. Now, structural unemployment, as we discussed, that also happens due to technology changes and so on and so forth. Right? So for that, the first and the foremost thing that the government can do is to provide training, to all these people who are getting unemployed, right? How would government do that? Government would, set up training centers. So in Pakistan, if I have to give you an example, that is called Punjab Skill Development Fund, right? And then there are a lot of other organizations operational in Pakistan that provides, vocational training. Now, what is vocational training? You teach people some new skills that are more in demand, like graphic designing, like, computer skills and data management and so on and so forth, so that people can become re-employed, so they can get employment again. So these are all the things. Okay, Arbab, another quick thing. If Abdul Rahim is not available for the class today, then we'll not have a class for AS. And in fact, we can do it in Saturday. So we can have a class on the Saturday and then we can do during that, because we still have time. Your exam is on 16th of November, right? So these are all the things. If you have shortlisted some other questions as well, essay questions for A2, tomorrow again, we'll have the class. Tomorrow is Saturday. So sorry, tomorrow is Friday, right? So we'll have a class at the usual timing. And then if you have